I want to talk about fear. Yeah, fear. And I want to talk about fear because it drives a much larger portion of our behavior than I think we realize. And hang on because this is going to get deep, but I promise you this is a subject worth your attention. Now, before we can jump right into talking about fear, we need to talk about habits for just a minute. And why habits? Well, one of the things we know for sure is that somewhere between 98 to 99% of our behavior is a habit. And there are literally dozens of studies that confirm this. We'll get into the connection between fear and habits in a minute, but first, just stop and think about that first statement. 98 to 99% of our behavior is habit. That means that you are actively in control of your behavior only 1 to 2% of the time. The other 98 to 99% driven by the habits you create, and you only create and actively steer those habits during the 1 to 2% of the time you're in control of your thoughts. Now, the thing about habits is that most of them are not something we actively create in our lives. They're just things we learn to do as we go about living our daily lives. Picking up a spoon to eat soup, opening a door, driving a car. Those actions are all habits that are learned during the first few times we do those things. In other words, when you pick up a spoon to eat, you're not actively thinking about it. Program that you put in your mind the first few times you tried doing it. Because during those first few times, you had to consciously think about what it was you were doing. And after a while, it's just pure habit. The harder part to understand and believe is that you're not thinking when you're operating based on your habits. As a living, thinking creature, you believe you're thinking because you're doing something, but you're not. When you're carrying out behavior programmed by a habit, you're not thinking. At least, not in the way you think you are. Your brain is on autopilot, and the parts of the brain described as where the thinking happens are literally disconnected. Even listening to my voice right now, you're most likely operating in habit mode. You know how to listen, but until you begin to actively process what I'm saying and challenge your existing thoughts or understanding, you're not engaging the thinking part of your brain, and as a result, you aren't influencing the other 98 to 99% of your brain. You're programming. And that fact is tremendously powerful because once you understand this connection, you can begin to take steps to change your habits and start getting different results in your life than you've achieved so far. But it's easier said than done, and that's where fear comes in. Fear is an emotion, not a logical thought, and it's probably the strongest emotion we can experience. And unfortunately, our limbic system, which is one of the earliest parts of the human brain to develop, is in control of our emotions. Specifically, a structure called the amygdala, which is about the size of a peanut, is the part of the brain that links our limbic system to the more advanced functions of the brain. The most important functions, which include logical reasoning, language, and impulse control, occur in the most advanced part of the brain called the prefrontal cortex, or the PFC for short. What happens when we experience fear is that the amygdala literally turns off your PFC. It stops blood from flowing to your PFC and it disables most of the electrical chemical signals. There's even a name for this process, a hijack. And this process happens in about 0.04 seconds, almost 10 times faster than you can blink. So by the time you experience fear, your brain is already turned off. Almost. The good news is that there's always a little bit of our PFC that's turned on. And this little piece has the ability to short-circuit our emotions, but it's very slow and requires deliberate effort, and it's often painful. Just think about any time you've tried to overcome something that's scary. Usually you experience fear, then you have to calm yourself down and tell yourself it's okay. Ways. And if you do it a few times, eventually you learn not to be afraid of it to begin with. What I've just described is the process of habit formation. But the problem is that because we're humans and we're not actively in control of our thought processes most of the time, the habit loop of fear hesitation, and ultimately avoidance never changes. Think about it in this situation. Imagine a young boy wants to ask out a pretty girl at his school. When he thinks about doing it, he experiences the fear of rejection. If he chooses not to ask her out, he has now just reinforced the high fear. But if instead he calms himself down, reasons with himself, and approaches her anyway, regardless of the outcome, he has reduced the power that fear has over his own behavior, especially in future social situations. And that's what's so important about fear. It's something we experience, but we don't often recognize that we're experiencing it, and it drives the formation of habits that are often not in our best interest. The fear of asking for a raise at work, the fear of discussing something important with a friend or family member, the fear of asking for help with something, and the list goes on and on. This fear-based and habit-based behavior shapes us into who we are, and eventually creates very rigid patterns that are often self-defeating. But because we have a prefrontal cortex, we also have the opportunity to overrule our emotional responses if we choose to. Now, that's a lot of background on how and why fear controls most of our lives than we think, but let's talk about how to proactively apply this understanding to our lives to start getting some better results. None of this process is difficult to understand, and you probably understand it intuitively. Making it a routine practice in your life is where it becomes powerful, and it's 3 very simple steps. The first step is to recognize that you're experiencing fear. This is way harder than it sounds, because the limbic system doesn't have a place for language, and so it takes a little while to learn to do. In other words, fear is an emotion or a feeling, but as an emotion alone, it doesn't have a label in our minds until we actively think about it. At that point, it's possible to tell ourselves, I'm experiencing fear, or I'm afraid. But what's even more helpful than ourselves is actually labeling it specifically, like, I'm afraid to say something to the pretty girl because she might reject me, or I'm afraid to tell my coworker that I don't appreciate some of the jokes they tell because they might judge me. The second step is to consciously downregulate your response to the fear. The best way to do this is to breathe deeply. There's a lot of complex biology that goes into this process, but just to make it simple, know that deep breathing stimulates the part of the nervous system that allows us to regain control of our prefrontal cortex. While breathing, it's also important to challenge our thoughts. And the best way to do this is with questions or statements to ourselves, like, what am I afraid of? Or, let me just think about this for a few seconds. The act of asking or telling ourselves something more directly engages the PFC and puts it back in control. And the faster we can get to this, the less control the amygdala will have gained. And the last step is to remain in control of your emotional process and to use the logical reasoning centers of your brain to decide what to do. Each time you do this, you'll continue to experience fear as you attempt to regain control of your own mind, and actually limit how you experience fear by limiting its effect on the rest of your brain. So it's possible, but not easy, to change the influence fear has on our lives. But what's really important to understand is that if we don't get a handle on it, we're making 98 to 99% of our decisions with a part of our brain that literally can't think, and that's a scary thought. I would challenge you to observe other people and see if you can spot this behavior in them, but then also challenge yourself not to do the same. Recognize your emotional responses when they occur, put them aside, and become more of a thinker as you make decisions and train yourself to do things in your life with the logical reasoning part of your brain. Chances are, you'll get a little more of what you actually want in life if you do.